Somewhere in a supply depot outside Philadelphia sits a crate of small bronze medallions. They are Purple Hearts, the American military decoration awarded for wounds received in combat. When a Marine is hit by shrapnel in Iraq, a soldier is shot in Afghanistan, or a service member is wounded almost anywhere in the world, the medal pinned to their chest was very likely manufactured in 1945. The United States has not produced a new batch of Purple Hearts in roughly 8 decades. That single stockpile has supplied every American war since the end of the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, and there are still tens of thousands left over. Because in 1945, the War Department ordered 500,000 of them. Not for the wars that came, for the war that didn't. That war had a name, Operation Downfall. The planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled to begin on November 1st, 1945. There are still surplus medals in storage 8 decades later because on August 15th of that year, Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio. The war ended before the medals were needed. But it very nearly didn't end that way. Historians have argued for decades about the exact moment Japan chose surrender. What almost no one talks about is how close Japan came to not surrendering at all. And the question hanging over that moment is one of the darkest counterfactuals of the 20th century. What if Japan had never surrendered in 1945? To answer it, we have to understand what was actually being prepared on both sides of the Pacific in the summer of that year. 2 invasions, 2 doctrines, 2 governments, each convinced the other was on the verge of collapse. And a plan so massive that its shadow 500,000 medals, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers still lingers in warehouses today. This is the story of the war that was ready to happen. The story doesn't begin in August 1945. It begins over a year earlier on a small volcanic island in the Central Pacific called Saipan. On July 18, 1944, American forces overran the last Japanese positions there, and the political consequences reached Tokyo within hours. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man who had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, resigned in disgrace. The reason was simple. Saipan sat within long-range bomber range of the Japanese home islands. For the first time in the war, Tokyo itself was within reach. The myth of Japanese invulnerability shattered that day. And in the vacuum, the Imperial General Headquarters began doing something unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. It began planning in detail for the destruction of its own country. That plan was called Ketsu-Go, the decisive operation. In January 1945, Emperor Hirohito formally approved it. What Ketsu-Go proposed was not a defense of Japan in any conventional sense. It was a strategy of total national self-immolation, designed to inflict such catastrophic casualties on invading Allied forces that the United States, exhausted, bleeding, politically fractured, would negotiate a settlement rather than press for unconditional surrender. The goal was not victory. The goal was to make victory too expensive to want. The doctrine had a slogan spoken publicly by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki as the war entered its final phase. Ichioku Gyokusai, 100 million honorable deaths. The decisive battle for the homeland. The number was not rhetoric, it was policy. In June 1945, the Diet passed the Volunteer Military Service Law. Every Japanese citizen between the ages of 15 and 60 was drafted into the National Volunteer Combat Corps. Women, school children, the elderly, 28 million people formally organized into a militia. They were issued whatever weapons the state could produce. There is a persistent image of the civilian army that has become almost cartoonish. Grandmothers in kimonos gripping sharpened bamboo poles, as if the defense of Japan rested on medieval improvisation. It's not wrong, but it's misleading. Because beneath the bamboo, the Japanese military had also stockpiled 2.5 million modern rifles, thousands of machine guns, and millions of grenades. These were reserved specifically for civilian volunteer units in designated defense zones. The bamboo spears were the propaganda layer. Beneath them was a real, if desperate, insurgent force, one that had erased, legally and doctrinally, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants across an entire nation of 80 million people. The battlefield they were being prepared to defend was a defender's dream. Southern Kyushu, the projected first Allied landing site, is a landscape of volcanic mountains, deep ravines, and narrow pocket beaches flanked by steep cliffs. The Japanese army had turned this terrain into a subterranean fortress. Hundreds of miles of tunnels, hidden artillery emplacements, and cave complexes designed to survive intense naval and aerial bombardment. They had built essentially a continent-sized version of Okinawa. And Okinawa is where the American calculation began to shift. On April 1st, 1945, U.S. Marines and Army units began landing on the Ryukyu island of Okinawa. What was supposed to be a stepping stone to the Japanese mainland turned into a battle so brutal that its name became warning inside the Pentagon. Roughly 12,000 American dead, 49,000 wounded. And on the Japanese side, more than 100,000 soldiers killed and critically, an estimated 100,000 civilians dead. Many were killed by the Japanese army itself. Others died in mass suicides encouraged by Japanese officers, who told villagers that American troops would rape and torture them. Okinawa was one small island. Kyushu was many times larger, closer to the enemy's core, and defended by a hardened home army rather than a distant garrison. If the casualty ratio was anything close to the same, the mathematics of a mainland invasion became unbearable. In Washington, on June 18, 1945, President Harry Truman convened a meeting in the Oval Office that would set the course of everything that came after. Truman had been president for barely 2 months. He had inherited the war from Franklin Roosevelt, who had died in April. And he had inherited it at the stage when every decision cost lives on an industrial scale. Around him that afternoon sat the Joint Chiefs of Staff. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, wanted an invasion. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, wanted a blockade. And via cable from Manila, Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. Army forces in the Pacific, wanted an invasion he would personally lead. Each man wanted a different war. Marshall believed a decisive land campaign, however costly, was the only way to force Japanese capitulation before its political system could regroup. King's position was that a prolonged blockade of the Japanese home islands, combined with continued firebombing, would starve Japan into surrender within a year at a fraction of the human cost. MacArthur wanted the largest amphibious operation in human history. Privately, he consistently downplayed the higher casualty estimates to keep the invasion on the calendar and under his command. Truman listened. Then he asked the question every president asks, and no one ever answers cleanly. How many Americans would die? Marshall gave him the official figure: 31,000 casualties in the first 30 days of the initial landings on Kyushu. It was a conservative estimate, and Marshall knew it was conservative. Outside that room, other numbers were already circulating. The Joint War Plans Committee had modeled scenarios ranging from 100,000 to 500,000 total American casualties. Former President Herbert Hoover consulted informally, gave Truman a much darker figure, between 500,000 and 1 million American dead. Truman would later cite something close to Hoover's number in his memoirs, though historians still dispute how much that specific estimate shaped his thinking at the time. Truman approved the invasion anyway. But another option was emerging. On July 16th, in the desert outside Alamogordo, New Mexico, a device codenamed Trinity detonated in a flash brighter than the sun. It was the world's first atomic bomb. Truman received the report while attending the Potsdam Conference in occupied Germany, and he understood immediately what it meant. He now had, for the first time, a strategic alternative to a land invasion. 2 tracks, downfall on one, the Manhattan Project on the other. Whichever ended the war first would end it. But before either could be executed, a third factor entered the calculation. And it entered through Tokyo's own signals. Deep inside a Washington office building, a team of American cryptographers had been reading Japan's most secret diplomatic and military traffic for over a year. The program had 2 names: Magic for diplomatic intercepts and Ultra for military ones. Together, they gave American planners something no invader in history had ever possessed: near real-time knowledge of what the enemy was doing. And what the enemy was doing in the summer of 1945 was building a wall. On July 21st, Ultra intercepts confirmed that the Japanese 16th Area Army had massively reinforced southern Kyushu. 700,000 troops, the exact size the Americans had gambled would not be present, were dug in around the projected landing beaches. And they had guessed the landing sites correctly. The invasion that had been calibrated for a partially defended target was now aimed directly at a fully defended one. In Washington, the response was closer to panic than to policy. Marshall began openly discussing tactical options that had until that moment been unthinkable. Chemical weapons, mustard gas, and phosgene saturating the beach approaches. Atomic bomb, not the strategic weapons eventually used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but tactical devices dropped ahead of advancing troops to vaporize defensive lines before American soldiers ever set foot on them. By late July, Marshall cabled MacArthur with a warning. We must expect a level of resistance that will make Okinawa look like a minor skirmish. None of this was rhetoric. The plans were being drafted. Then, at the end of July, the war lurched toward its climax. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration, a joint ultimatum from the United States, Britain, and China, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, or, in its own phrase, prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese cabinet's response was ambiguous, but the hardliners inside it interpreted the ultimatum as unacceptable, and the government issued a formal rejection. On August 6th, an atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima. On August 9th, two things happened at once. In the pre-dawn hour, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched 1.5 million Red Army troops across the Manchurian border. That single stroke shattered the Japanese High Command's last hope, the belief that Moscow, still officially neutral, might mediate a negotiated peace. Later the same day, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, destroyed Nagasaki. Inside the Imperial Palace, the arguments split the Japanese government in two. On one side stood Emperor Hirohito and the moderates who wanted to accept the Potsdam terms and preserve what remained of the country. On the other stood Korechika Anami, the army minister, a man raised on the samurai code of Bushido, who believed surrender was worse than annihilation itself. Backed by Army Chief Yoshijiro Umezu, Anami argued that Japan could still inflict enough damage on any invasion to force better peace terms. No occupation, no dismantling of the military, preservation of the imperial system as it was. The emperor overruled them. On the night of August 14th, he recorded a speech accepting the Potsdam Declaration. The recording was scheduled to be broadcast the next day, and it almost never made it out of the palace. Just after midnight on August 15th, a young army officer named Major Kenji Hatanaka led a group of rebel officers into the Imperial Household Ministry. Their goal was to seize the phonograph records containing the emperor's speech, arrest the moderates in the cabinet, and force the continuation of the war. They shot the commander of the palace guards. They cut the telephone lines. They searched the ministry building room by room in darkness using flashlights, but they didn't find the records. The recording had been hidden inside a laundry basket in an obscure office. The officials who knew its location had gone underground inside the palace grounds. As dawn approached, the coup lost momentum. Loyalist troops from the Eastern District Army began arriving. Hatanaka shot himself in front of the palace gates. Anami, the war minister, who had opposed surrender but refused to join the coup, committed ritual suicide in his official residence. He left a final testament that read, "I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for my great crime." At noon on August 15th, the emperor's voice went out over the radio. The Second World War was over. That is what happened. But historians have documented in unusual detail just how close the alternative came to happening. The recording survived because of a laundry basket and a few loyal officials. Had the coup succeeded, had Hatanaka's men found the records, silenced the emperor, and installed a military government committed to Ketsu-Go, the war would not have ended in August. Operation Downfall would have launched. The Purple Hearts in that Philadelphia warehouse would not still be sitting there. Imagine then that the flashlights found the laundry basket, or that the officials guarding it broke and revealed the location under interrogation, or that Hatanaka's men were not stopped at dawn by loyalist troops, but reinforced by their own. There is no single point of divergence, only a night of narrow accidents that could have gone the other way. In this alternate history, the coup succeeds. The moderates are arrested before sunrise. The emperor is placed under palace confinement, his voice silenced, not by his own choice, but by officers who claim to be defending him. By the morning of August 15th, a new government has taken power in Tokyo, a military junta drawn from the surviving Anami faction, publicly and irrevocably committed to Ketsu-Go. The Potsdam Declaration is rejected a second time. The war does not end. In Washington, the reaction is grief followed by cold arithmetic. Truman had gambled that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet declaration of war, would break the Japanese government from within. That gamble has now failed. The atomic weapons have not produced the psychological collapse he was told they would produce. Which means the alternative, the one that was always meant to be the alternative, has to be executed. Marshall's staff activate the downfall directive signed back in May. Operation Olympic. The amphibious assault on southern Kyushu is locked for November 1st. Operation Coronet, the follow-on landing on the Kanto Plain near Tokyo, is scheduled for March of the following year. But something else is now on the table. On September 15th, Marshall approves detailed operational plans for the tactical use of chemical and nuclear weapons in support of the invasion. The chemical component mustard gas and phosgene is planned for the beach approach to disable Japanese defenders in coastal caves before American landing craft touch shore. The nuclear component is planned for tactical deployment ahead of the ground advance. Somewhere between 7 and 9 atomic bombs are estimated to be available for the operation based on the pace of plutonium core production at Los Alamos. They are not being reserved for cities. They are being reserved for defensive lines. The atomic bomb in this world is no longer a strategic terror weapon reserved for exceptional use. It is being folded into the standard toolkit of the field commander. The word for what follows is normalization. Before either invasion can begin, however, the United States begins to strangle Japan. On October 1st, 1945, the U.S. Navy establishes an absolute blockade of Honshu and Kyushu. No merchant vessel is permitted in or out. Coastal shipping is destroyed. Fishing boats are sunk on sight. In a country whose imported food supply had already collapsed under the bombing campaigns of the previous year, this means famine. The Japanese civilian ration in early 1945 had already fallen to around 1,500 calories per day, below subsistence level. By late autumn, under total blockade, later reconstructions suggest daily intake drops below 1,000 calories across most of the population. Children stop growing. Elderly citizens stop surviving the winter. The entire physical foundation of the civilian militia, the 28 million people the government intended to arm and deploy against the invaders, is being hollowed out from within. And that is the point. Curtis LeMay, the Army Air Forces general who had directed the firebombing of Japanese cities, understood this arithmetic better than almost anyone. His B-29s had already reduced 67 Japanese cities to ash before the atomic bombs were dropped. In this scenario, the firebombing does not stop in August. It intensifies. The remaining infrastructure is systematically destroyed. Food storage sites, rail nodes, factory dispersal zones. The blockade takes the food away. The bombers take away the ability to distribute what remains. By the last week of October, aerial reconnaissance photographs show something American planners find both encouraging and deeply disturbing. Japanese civilians move out of the cities in mass columns, searching for food in rural areas. Coastal villages stand hollowed out. The emperor remains in Tokyo, silent and unable to broadcast, unable to plead for surrender, unable even to ask the population to endure. He is the last remaining source of legitimacy for a government that has already lost the material capacity to feed its people. And then, on November 1st, the invasion begins. The armada assembled off the southern coast of Kyushu is the largest amphibious force ever gathered in human history. 14 battleships, 26 aircraft carriers, more than 1,000 smaller warships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers aboard transports stretching from horizon to beach. The operational commander of the landing forces is General Walter Kruger of the U.S. 6th Army, a veteran of New Guinea and the Philippines, now tasked with executing the most dangerous single operation in the history of American arms. The landing beaches have already been named: Miyazaki, Ariake Bay, Kushikino. Each is guarded by cliffs riddled with hidden gun emplacements and defensive belts stretching miles inland. Naval bombardment begins at first light, 3 hours of continuous shelling. Then the boats go in. What happens over the next 48 hours is unlike anything seen earlier in the Pacific War, because Japan has been waiting. At approximately 0630, engines begin starting inside hundreds of camouflaged cave hangars scattered across Kyushu and Honshu. What emerges over the following hours is not an air force in any conventional sense. It is something Japan has spent an entire year assembling in secret. A fleet of roughly 10,700 aircraft. Most are obsolete trainers, retrofitted with explosives, and flown by pilots who have only enough training to take off, navigate toward a distant horizon, and steer. They are not meant to return. The Japanese Navy has codenamed this the No. 6 Ketsu-Go operation. American planners know about the aircraft. Ultra intelligence identified the buildup in July, but when the attack comes, its scale exceeds what the fleet's defenses were built to absorb. Japanese planes fly at wave-top altitude to defeat radar. They approach in packs. When American destroyer screens engage the first wave, a second and third are already inbound. By nightfall on November 1st, the U.S. Fifth Fleet's picket line is bleeding. Estimates vary, but historical simulations based on Okinawa-scale attrition suggest that between 300 and 500 Allied ships are damaged during the first week. Perhaps 100 to 200 are sunk or crippled beyond repair. Among the dead are thousands of American sailors, men who never set foot on Japanese soil, but who paid the entrance fee for those who did. The landings themselves, however, succeed. They succeed because Japanese defensive doctrine, ironically, is not centered entirely on the beach. The kamikazes target the fleet. The coastal artillery targets the landing craft. But the inland defensive belts, the tunnel networks, ridge fortifications, and ambush zones are designed to bleed the invaders slowly over months once they are ashore. In that longer war, the Americans have the advantage of a supply line the Japanese cannot cut. The Japanese have the disadvantage of a population already beginning to starve. By mid-November, the beaches are held. But the interior of Kyushu is not. What follows is the kind of ground combat that American Marines and soldiers would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The historian Richard Frank, working from primary sources and the observed tactics of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, has modeled what the Kyushu campaign might have looked like at the operational level. In his reconstruction, the U.S. Sixth Army faces not only fixed Japanese Army positions, but the National Volunteer Combat Corps, armed civilians fighting inside designated defense zones alongside their families. American Marines clear caves the way they cleared them on Okinawa. Corkscrew and blowtorch tactics. Satchel charges seal the exits. Flamethrowers burn the interiors. And inside those caves, in Frank's assessment, they find not only soldiers, but women teenagers and elderly civilians armed with sharpened stakes and indoctrinated to die rather than surrender. The moral consequences are impossible to model precisely. But historians who have studied the invasion plans agree on one thing. Combat in Kyushu would have generated a category of psychological injury unprecedented in the American military experience up to that point. Soldiers ordered to burn families out of caves do not come home the same men. And behind the ground combat, the tactical nuclear program is already accelerating. By early December, the first tactical atomic bombs are being staged at forward air bases in the Marianas. They are being reserved for the Coronet phase, the assault on Tokyo, but the doctrinal precedent has already been set. The bomb is now a battlefield tool. Like artillery, only larger. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles to the north, something else is happening. Because Joseph Stalin has been watching. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan on August 9, 1945. Its Red Army, 1.5 million strong, hardened by 4 years of combat against the Wehrmacht, smashed through the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria within a matter of weeks. By late autumn, Soviet forces hold Manchuria, northern Korea, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. But Stalin never intended those to be his final gains. His true objective was Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's 4 main home islands. Stalin's plan was not speculative, it was documented. The 87th Rifle Corps had been prepared specifically for the operation, staged on Sakhalin, and equipped with what limited amphibious lift the Soviet Pacific Fleet possessed. In the actual timeline, Stalin canceled the Hokkaido landing when Japan surrendered, and Truman told him bluntly that the United States would not accept Soviet occupation of any part of the home islands. But in a world where the war continues into 1946, and where American forces are pinned down on Kyushu, that veto loses much of its force. There is a myth about the counterfactual invasion, that it would have been an American war ending in an American occupation, and that post-war Japan would still have been unified beneath a MacArthur regency. That myth is wrong. Because on December 1st, 1945, in this counterfactual scenario, Soviet Marines of the 87th Rifle Corps scramble from crude landing craft onto the beaches near Rumoi on Hokkaido's west coast. They raise the red flag over Japanese territory. Whether such a landing could have succeeded is genuinely disputed among historians. Some argue that the Soviet Pacific Fleet lacked the logistical capacity to sustain it against determined resistance. Others, following the historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's reconstruction, argue that with American attention pinned to Kyushu and Manchurian rail lines feeding Soviet supply, Stalin would have attempted it and could have made it stick. Either way, the political consequence is the one Stalin had prepared for. A Soviet foothold on the Japanese home islands, established while the war is still being fought, and impossible to remove without starting another war. The line that will divide Japan is already being drawn. By January 15, 1946, under the projections of historian D.M. Giangreco, Allied forces have secured southern Kyushu at appalling cost. American casualties for the Olympic phase alone are estimated at between 150,000 and more than 400,000, depending on which planning documents are given the most weight. Japanese military dead exceed 500,000. Japanese civilian deaths from combat starvation continued bombing, and the slow attrition of blockade pass 1 million by the new year. The air bases the Americans came for are now operational. B-29s begin flying missions from Kyushu itself, closer to Tokyo than any American aircraft has operated during the war. Preparations for Operation Coronet, the assault on the Kanto Plain aimed directly at the imperial capital, accelerate. And on that plain, the last organized Japanese army is dug in, waiting. The war that was supposed to end in the summer of 1945 has, by New Year's 1946, killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs did in our timeline, many times over. And the campaign for Tokyo has not yet begun. March 1st, 1946. Just before dawn on the Kanto Plain, the invasion fleet off the eastern coast of Honshu is even larger than the one assembled off Kyushu the previous November. 22 Allied divisions are staged to land across the beaches of Kujukuri and Sagami Bay. The operational objective is not merely a beachhead. It is Tokyo itself, the imperial capital, and the political heart of a regime that has ruled a starving country under absolute wartime martial law for more than half a year. But the landings on Kanto will not begin the way Olympic did. Before the first American Marine steps into the surf, a B-29 configured for special weapons delivery flies alone ahead of the assault fleet. Its target is a fortified defensive line east of Kujukuri, where Japanese intelligence has predicted the main American landing and prepared accordingly. At approximately 0645, the weapon detonates. The historian D.M. Giangreco, working from surviving operational documents concerning the tactical nuclear program, has argued that this is what battlefield atomic doctrine would have meant in practice. Not a city, not a demonstration. A defensive line vaporized, followed by a ground force advancing through the crater. Whether the first tactical strike would have been the only one is impossible to know. By early 1946, Los Alamos had reached a plutonium production rate capable of delivering perhaps one bomb every 3 weeks. Marshall's staff had modeled the use of between 7 and 9 such weapons across Coronet as a whole. Once the precedent was set, it would not remain narrow. American troops advance into a landscape where the ground itself is contaminated. Surviving Japanese defenders remain in secondary trench lines in the mountain and among the ruins of Chiba Prefecture. And they continue fight. Because that is what the doctrine demands. Ketsu-Go was never about winning. It was about making the invaders pay a price they could not sustain. By mid-March, American armored columns are within artillery range of Tokyo. The imperial capital has endured intermittent firebombing for more than a year. By this point, less than a third of its pre-war buildings remain standing. The emperor, still nominally on the throne, still politically silenced by the junta that seized power the previous August, is moved from the palace into an underground command bunker in the mountains west of the city. What happens next is where the historical record thins into nothing. Because nothing like it has ever happened. The Japanese military government does not surrender. It does not announce an end. What ends instead is the physical capacity of the Japanese state to organize resistance on a national scale. Sometime in April or May 1946, in the reconstructions historians have attempted, Tokyo falls. Not in one decisive engagement. The Kanto Plain is too large for that. It falls through a rolling collapse of defensive perimeters, fought house by house and block by block by soldiers and civilians who have been told for months that surrender is worse than death. The emperor dies. Whether he is killed by American ordnance, takes his own life, or is executed by junta officers who fear he may attempt to surrender, is one of the darkest unknowns in the counterfactual. What can be known is that his death removes the last remaining source of legitimate political authority in Japan. And with it, whatever coordinated resistance survives the invasion begins to disintegrate. There is no formal surrender. There is only the slow silencing of a country. Guerrilla resistance continues in the mountains of Honshu and in Hokkaido, where the Soviet occupation zone has hardened into a de facto communist authority. Sporadic combat in the highlands drags on for another 2 or 3 years. By mid-1946, American occupation forces control the major population centers of southern and central Honshu. But they are governing a devastated territory with no functioning national administration to receive them. By the time the fighting can be said to have ended, boundary historians can only draw approximately, the counterfactual has produced casualty figures that dwarf every other campaign of the Second World War. Working from Richard Frank's estimates, among the most widely cited in the field, total Allied casualties across downfall reach somewhere between 1,200,000 and 4 million. American dead alone number between 300,000 and 1 million. Japanese deaths, military and civilian combined, including starvation disease and the effects of tactical nuclear use, fall between 5 and 10 million. These numbers are so large that they begin to lose meaning. It helps to think of them another way. In our timeline, the entire American death toll of the Second World War across every theater was approximately 405,000. The counterfactual invasion of Japan alone, even at its lowest estimate, approaches that number. At its highest, it more than doubles it. And the war is over. What follows is not. The Japan that emerges from the ruins of downfall in 1946 is not the Japan of our timeline. There is no clean American occupation. There is no MacArthur-drafted democratic constitution unifying the country beneath a single administrative framework. There is no post-war economic miracle beginning under the protection of a U.S. security guarantee. There is instead a country cut in half. North of a line running roughly through Hokkaido and the northern tip of Honshu, Soviet forces occupy what will become, over the following years, the Democratic People's Republic of Japan. It is administered from Sapporo, supported by Soviet arms, and populated by a citizenry that has been starving beneath blockade and combat for nearly 2 years. The Kremlin installs a compliant government drawn from pre-war Japanese leftist movements. Within 18 months, the border is sealed. South of that line, under Allied occupation, a reduced Japanese state is reconstructed from what remains of the imperial administration. The chrysanthemum throne, with the emperor dead and no successor accepted as legitimate by both the occupiers and the surviving Japanese public, is either abolished or reduced to symbolic figurehead status. A parliamentary government is imposed by the occupation authority, but the institutional and human foundations needed to build it have been shattered. Tokyo is physically ruined. Roughly 90% of its central wards are estimated to have been destroyed. The city's population, which stood at around 6 million before the war, has fallen to perhaps 1.5 million by mid-1946. The rest are dead, displaced, or living in makeshift refugee zones scattered across the plain. The border between the two Japans becomes one of the defining frontiers of the Cold War. It is the closest analog to what happened to Korea in our timeline, but on a larger scale, involving a more industrialized society and carrying the psychological weight of a nation that had spent a generation convincing itself of its own uniqueness. For Japanese families, the consequences last for generations. Relatives on opposite sides of the border spend decades unable to communicate. The economic recovery of the South, without the coal-steel capacity and agricultural land of the North, is slower and harsher than the miracle Japan actually achieved. Reunification becomes, as it did in Korea, a subject governments invoke at anniversaries and never seriously pursue. But the divided Japan is not the deepest change this counterfactual makes to the world. The deepest change is what happens to the atomic bomb. In our timeline, the weapons used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were singular in one specific and important sense. They were used against cities twice at the end of a war. No atomic weapon has been used in combat since. The horror of those two detonations grew over the decades that followed into what strategic thinkers call the nuclear taboo, an unwritten norm that nuclear weapons are categorically different from every other weapon and that their use is politically unthinkable except in the most extreme circumstances. That norm helped keep the Cold War cold. It constrained decision-makers during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It shaped the doctrine of mutually assured destruction and contributed to the treaties that eventually reduced nuclear arsenals near the end of the 20th century. The counterfactual world does not possess that norm, because in that world, atomic weapons were not used once or twice. They were used 8 or 9 times in combat against military targets in support of a conventional ground campaign. The bomb was not treated as a weapon of last resort. It was integrated into ordinary battlefield doctrine, alongside artillery and close air support. Nuclear weapons in the world that emerges from downfall are not taboo. They are tactical. What follows is the arms race we know, but calibrated differently. When the Korean War arrives, it is fought beneath a doctrine that considers battlefield atomic weapons routine. In our timeline, General MacArthur was relieved of command in part because he advocated their use in Korea. In this alternate world, that position would not have been extraordinary. The Vietnam conflict, or whatever equivalent emerges in its place, unfolds beneath the same assumptions. Whether this leads to a broader nuclear exchange somewhere during the Cold War is impossible to know. Some historians who have examined this counterfactual argue that the absence of a psychological barrier against nuclear use would increase the probability of catastrophic escalation. Others argue that repeated tactical use might desensitize the great powers, without necessarily triggering a strategic exchange. Neither possibility is comforting. And then there is the demographic hole. In our timeline, the Second World War killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people worldwide. That number is already almost impossible for the human mind to hold. The counterfactual adds at minimum another 6 million deaths American, Allied, Japanese, and Soviet. At the higher estimates, it adds closer to 14 million. The people who die in downfall are not distributed evenly across the population. They are disproportionately young men and young women. American Marines and soldiers in their late teens and 20s. Japanese civilian militia of both sexes drawn from every generation, but concentrated among the working-age population. An entire cohort of Japanese school children deployed through the National Volunteer Combat Corps. The literature, science, and political leadership of the second half of the 20th century in Japan, the United States, and the Soviet Union would have emerged from a generation thinned on an unimaginable scale. The novelists who never came home. The engineers who never built. The politicians who never grew into leadership. Every measure of what post-war civilization produced would have been diminished by the difference between those who survived the war and those who would have died in downfall. It is a silent generation in the most literal sense. The absent one. None of this happened. At noon on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice went out over the radio, and the war ended. The coup failed. The recordings survived. The moderates prevailed by a margin so narrow that Richard Frank, whose scholarship on the surrender crisis is among the closest things to a definitive account, has written that the survival of the broadcast came down to hours, and in some sense to luck. There is a persistent belief, still widely argued in university classrooms, that Japan would have surrendered anyway. That the atomic bombs and the invasion planning were unnecessary. That the country was already beaten by August 1945. But the primary records of the Japanese military high command from that final week tell a more dangerous story. These were the men who tried to seize the emperor's speech, who committed ritual suicide rather than accept the Potsdam terms, who had spent a year organizing 28 million civilians into a defensive militia and assembling 10,000 aircraft for suicide attacks. They are the strongest evidence we have that surrender was not inevitable. In that moment, it was contingent. It could have gone the other way. The 500,000 Purple Hearts remained in their crates because it didn't. They have been drawn down slowly during every American war that followed. Korea used some. Vietnam used more. The Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan used what remained. But tens of thousands are still left. Somewhere in a Philadelphia supply depot, or in warehouses scattered throughout the American military logistics system, they wait to be pinned to the chests of another generation of wounded American soldiers. They are the material trace of the world that almost was. The war that almost happened. The medals we almost had to give out. The generation that almost did not come home. And the border running east from Hokkaido across a nation cut in half that almost carved another permanent line into the map of the 20th century. When we look at those medals, when we look at them at all, we understand something about the world we inherited. It is not the only one that was possible.